Hello out there, welcome to Wake Up to the Bible. I'm Daniel Kaplan. I'm here with my father, Dr. Kaplan. Together we're reading through the books of the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, a little bit every day. Today we're going to be reading Genesis 41:39 through 52. I'll be reading from the Robert Alter translation, and then we will discuss what we read. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, after God has made known to you all this, there is none as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and by your lips all my folk shall be guided. By the throne alone shall I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and put it on Joseph's hand, and had him clothed in fine linen clothes, and placed the golden collar around his neck. And he had him ride in the chariot of his viceroy, and they called out before him Abrech, setting him over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, without you no man shall raise hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, as wife. And Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and passed through all the land of Egypt. And the land in the 7 years of plenty made gatherings. And he collected all the food of the 7 years that were in the land of Egypt. And he placed food in the cities. The food from the fields round each city he placed within it. And Joseph piled up grain like the sand of the sea very much until he ceased counting, for it was beyond count. And to Joseph 2 sons were born before the coming of the famine, whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, meaning, God has released me from all the debt of my hardship and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, meaning, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. All right, so we have things moving and a grooving. It's like this would be like in musicals there'd be like this montage. Although actually they don't really do much with this in Joseph's Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. They just kind of skip ahead. So that's a little lame to go talk to Andrew Lloyd Webber about that. But because you just kind of picture this, it's almost like Zero to Hero and Hercules. It's like and he's like rolling along and stuff like that. It is really interesting though because what he says is, um, he says, after God has made known to you all this, there's none as discerning and wise as you. So Sean had a good point in terms of obviously Pharaoh is really, he's really figured out what's going on. He's figured out that not only is Joseph a very shrewd person, but he's directly getting in, divine insight. And so this does speak a lot to this Pharaoh's capability of seeing reality for anything else. It is quite impressive, especially in the short span of time. But obviously, he does seem concerned about not only maybe his power, but also his citizens as well. So, which would make him a good ruler if that was the case. And I like to give people the best read possible.
You repeat again what you commented on just then?
What I just commented on?
Right.
Well, no, that it just shows that the Pharaoh was really in with it, in with reality. He really understood that God was working through Joseph and that Joseph was incredibly shrewd. I mean, that's a lot to accept, especially in the short period of time you have here. So, may have just been divine intervention that God just revealed that to the Pharaoh. It could speak to the Pharaoh's character that he just was so concerned about his citizens that knowing what was going to happen, he was, willing to concede that. I mean, I don't know, but it is really interesting. Well, especially considering the contrast later, right?
Well, you can have an occasional good ruler. That happens. They're not all not all the pharaohs are necessarily Yul Brynner. But I was comment. The term avrech, although it may have been originally an Egyptian term, but in Hebrew it would have to do with bow down, bend the knee. I don't know if Alter comments on that. He just leaves it untranslated,
Mm-hmm.
but it could be.
Yeah.
It could
Well, he says, despite the ingenuity of traditional commentators in construing this as an Egyptian word, it is evidently Egyptian and may mean something like make way. That's what he says.
oh, and making it a Hebrew word, he said.
Yeah.
He said so. All right.
Yeah.
So, but it's kind of interesting that there's a Hebrew term so closely related that
Mm-hmm.
it seems to mean something similar.
Yeah.
But all right.
Well,
Um,
I mean, it does make sense because Zaphnath Paneah is not Hebrew.
oh
We
yeah.
actually don't
No,
even we actually don't
that's not.
even 100% know what it means. It's a little
Yeah, there's
mysterious. There's
differences
different
of
postulations.
what it might
It
mean.
seems to be something like the general consensus. What I've seen, it seems to be something about revealer of secrets, or
Well,
somebody with divine insight
well,
kind of thing.
I think the more contemporary interpretation is that he gives life, he preserves life,
Hmm.
and that would be
Interesting.
what Joseph did, and in either way there's Christological implications to the
Yeah.
title.
Robert Alter says his postulation is God speaks, he lives. And
Yeah,
that
that
comes from,
right.
yeah, that comes from Egyptologists and other people.
That's
Yeah.
and that's similar, by the way, to one of the names that the I think the name uh, Belteshazzar
Hmm.
is, or one of those Chaldean names you read about in Daniel.
Yeah.
It's a similar
Interesting.
similar meaning.
Yeah.
What did they call? What was Daniel's? Was Belteshazzar the name?
Belteshazzar is Daniel, yeah.
Daniel's name, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think I think a
I
similar,
should know. No.
similar. You're right, yeah. Similar meaning there.
I always go by Belteshazzar whenever I'm visiting that region of the world.
Oh, okay. And then there's another point here. This is more of a linguistic point, but when Pharaoh tells him, you're going to be the just second, more or less second in command.
Hmm.
Um, uh, he says, "All the people shall be ruled according to your word."
Hmm.
How does Alter translate verse 40?
By your lips, all my folk shall be guided.
And does he comment on that? Literally, you could
He
translate it.
says, Hebrew says literally by your mouth. The clear meaning is by your commands, by the directs you issue. There is some doubt about the verb
Ishak.
yishak. Yeah. The usual sense of will kiss is extremely unlikely here, unless this is a peculiar idiom for civil obedience,
All
not otherwise
right.
attends.
That's exactly what I was going to say. And I didn't know this. I think it may have been an Egyptian idiom. Everyone will kiss your, on your lips, all will kiss, as maybe an idiom meaning that they're all going to be,
Mm,
do what you say. But, okay, I'll shut up now. Let my son read the altar explanation. But it's an interesting passage. In other words, there's translation issues here. I just wanted
hmm.
to bring them out.
Yeah.
But let's hear the whole altar comment.
That's what he said. I just read
Oh,
it.
okay. Repeat it again.
He says the usual sense of will kiss is extremely unlikely here unless this is a peculiar idiom for civil obedience not otherwise attested.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, most people want to translate it
It's best
differently.
to associate it with the noun meshek, which refers to economic administration.
Ah, very good. Yeah, all right.
But again, this is where you end up with there's a lot of Egyptian stuff going on in this section,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
right.
there might be some, we're losing a little bit of some of the flavor of it. Because obviously the meaning is still understood, but
Yeah,
if it was an idiom, it was lost. But it is what it
yeah,
is.
but yeah, there are various ways that they translate that term, and
Hmm.
meshek is interesting. The relationship there.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Now, when it comes to the clothed in fine linen clothes, and that kind of goes back to the coat thing, right? Because you have
Aha.
him clothed at the beginning, and now he's clothed again, so that's coming back. And then the collar around his neck. Well, he would have worn a slave collar, probably. That was a common thing. So he going from this iron collar to this golden collar. So that's a nice little parallel as well.
Now, Potiphera, uh,
Potiphar.
I doubt it's spelled a little bit differently. It's not the same word as Potiphar, but
Hmm.
evidently they go back to the same meaning.
Hmm.
It's like in English we have some names,
Like Alexander or Alex.
maybe yeah, okay, that's the point. And that's I'm glad that you came up with that. uh, but anyway, but I think Potiphar, it identifies him, not only does it spell his name differently, but it identifies him as a priest of On, whereas the other Potiphar was a captain of the guards. It doesn't seem like it's the same
Hmm.
Potiphar.
Yeah.
And I think On may be a name for the chief Egyptian god, Amen, but I'll check on that. But On may be another name for
What
Amen.
Alter says is On is not a deity, but the name of a city later designated Heliopolis by the Greeks because of the sun worship centered there. That's what he said.
Oh, so he calls it a location
Uh
rather.
huh.
Wow.
Hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's
That
interesting.
would be less troubling.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
If it's just somebody at a location versus somebody that worshipped another god, because obviously it's like what's Joseph doing marrying somebody who's a priest of another god. That's
Well, if you want,
like the daughter of another god like that. That's a little
if you
weird.
want to get really technical about it, the term for priest could also refer to some kind of supervisory position too. I think.
Hmm.
So it may be more of a secular than religious position even. I hadn't thought about that, but since he wants to make on a location,
Hmm.
then maybe even Kohen, if that's what the term is here, probably,
Right.
that
Now,
it may,
now, now, there is something you could, if you want to read into things, and I love to read into things. I'm a literary critic type. When we went back to the genealogy in earlier in Genesis, we had Leah and Rachel naming the kids. Here, Joseph names the kids, and perhaps maybe one of the reasons why is because it's trying to show the spiritual leading of the family because he is marrying somebody that is not of his ilk, as it were. Perhaps you could look at it that way, that he's taking ownership of the spiritual journey of the family in the way that the matriarchs didn't have to in the same way, possibly. But again, I'm reading into it. I'm not being dogmatic about
well,
that.
the fact that he was a priest of a pagan god is not necessarily all that problematic, because
We
they
don't
would
know what she believed
they would
either.
have been the ones who took a lot of who were the educators
Hmm.
and people who cared for people, and even maybe took care of other needs.
And he might have
So,
converted him to monotheism, for all you know.
but he could
Or
have
at
been.
least his daughter might have been converted into monotheism.
Yeah, that of course would be
You
what
would expect.
what Jews would want to think.
Yeah.
Who were reading this account.
Ooh, Sean's like, does that make Potiphar a priest like Melchizedek? Interesting. I don't know if I'd quite go there, but I understand what you're getting at.
Well, some people want to argue that maybe she was not of Egyptian stock. In other words, Joseph's children are half Egyptian,
Mm-hmm.
and so
Dun dun dun.
yes, some people want to say, well, maybe she was not of Egyptian stock. Maybe she was somehow a descendant of Shem in some way. But
That seems very
right, yeah,
gross. I don't like that.
yeah, yeah.
That seems like people that don't understand how genetics work and are trying to get a little creepy. So I'm not a fan of that. Now, obviously, you have Joseph piling up the grain like the sand of the sea, which really goes back to Abraham, right? Which I think is cool.
I'd like to go
Where
back.
where where it says until he ceased counting, for it was beyond count. I just think that's really beautiful symmetry going on, right? Here you have the descendant of Abraham, you know, being a really high ranking person in Egypt, which was a very, I mean, I don't want to speak out of turn, but it was like pretty much the big empire at the time. So
Mhm.
here you have somebody who's a descendant of Abraham reaching a very high level, and it's just very beautiful artistically, you know.
Now, again, Ephraim, uh, that ending is a dual ending, and so like doubly fruitful, so to speak. And but he does call it the land of my affliction, which shows that he thought of himself as being in exile. And remember, even when he was about to die, he wanted his bones carried back to the promised land. So there's all through the Bible, there's that focus on the ultimate inheritance, being the land of Israel, because he talks about the land of my affliction. Well, of course, he may be referring to all the trouble he had until now, so maybe the affliction is what was in the past, because now he's riding high.
Mm-hmm.
But I also wanted to mention Manasseh. usually he talks about forgetting, the meaning to forget. God is maybe to forget all my toil and all my father's house, and
Yep.
and so alter wants to alter this translation. So let's hear what he has to say.
He says the naming pun is on the verbal stem NSHH. The virtually universal construction of this term here is made me forget. But it must be said that the root in that sense occurs only 5 times in the biblical corpus, and at least 2 or 3 of those are doubtful. It is also somewhat odd that Joseph should celebrate God for having him forget his father's house. But in a very common usage of NSHH is to hold in debt. And the natural meaning of that stem is in the conjugation is here would be to relieve from the condition of debts. Such an unambiguously positive verb is a better parallel to made me fruitful in the next verse. And he is grateful to Amos Funkenstein for this suggestion. So there we go. That's where he got it from.
He's made me relieve.
Has released me from all the debt of my hardship, which is not that different than saying forget, but it's a different construction because I think they're both getting at the same thing. I wouldn't say that forgetting. I'm not quite with Alter because I don't. I think he's kind of
What about the
thinking
father's
about
house part? What? How did he do the whole sentence?
because it says release me from all the debt of my hardship and of my father's house, right?
What would be the debt of his father's house?
I think. What do you mean? What would be the debt?
Yeah, what do you mean of my hardship and my father's house? What does that have to do with the debt? What does he mean, the debt of my hardship in my father's house?
I think
Uh,
what he's saying is it's you can almost look at it as he's not under the he's now a father, which means now he's taken his place fully as the man of his own house.
oh, I see.
Right? It's so he's a mature adult, and so he's not under the debt of his father. He's fully responsible for himself. But what I don't necessarily have a problem with forgetting in the same way that Alter does, because I don't think of it as forgetting my father's house as in I'm like neglecting that where I came from. I think it's just talking
The
about
trouble, yeah.
yeah, it's like the stages of grief, right? The last stage, which I don't necessarily think is an exact science, but the last stage is acceptance, right? And ultimately to some degree you in order to recover, you do essentially have to kind of forget in that it can't just be at the forefront of your mind all the time. If your trauma is just always there and you're not willing to just kind of integrate it in and almost in a sense forget about it as being like that, you're not going to be fully healthy.
And
And I hope that makes sense. I don't want to misspeak there,
and
but
there are a lot of
it's a nuanced point.
he had a lot of negative memories, not just the
Yeah,
culmination, but just the tension that was there with the
right.
brothers. But I would like to look at the grammar. He says that because the word comes from to debt. So
Mhm.
what does he say? The word comes from to be in debt.
Hold on. I lost it. Where is it? Yes. Yes.
Go ahead.
NSHH.
Okay. To
The
be
common usage of that is to hold in debt, and a natural meaning that would stem in the conjugation is here would be to relieve from the condition of debt. So,
okay. I don't know.
because he says that forgetting incurs only 5 times, and 2 of 3
Right.
of those are doubtful. So,
But anyway, I'd have to see.
well, Andrew thinks that makes sense what I was saying, so that's good. I appreciate that,
I'd
Andrew.
have to see what
I'm glad I'm making sense.
from. I'd have to check on what
Yeah.
why grammatically he
Hmm.
comes up with that conclusion. How
You
you go?
just said so. I don't
I
understand your
know how you
confusion.
go from debt to relieving debt by putting a mem there in front of the root. I don't. I mean, I'm just speaking as a Hebrew grammarian, as it were.
I'm getting a little
But
technical here,
obviously, Walt
sir.
no Alter is
He
obviously
says
more
pil
qualified.
L conjugation.
Oh, okay. The PL congregation
Yeah.
conjugation he says means to relieve the
Uh-huh.
debt.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. I
Yeah.
mean, it may be used that way, so he would know. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I think he would know.
All
Right.
right. I'll go along with that.
Right. But
Yeah.
to his point, for those of you who like the forget translation, he would say that it does come up at least a couple of times the other way. So you have
All right.
that option.
I'm at
And
peace.
maybe it's both a little bit,
I'm
you
at
know?
peace with Robert Alter, and I would also like to point out that as Daniel said a moment ago, this is a work of literature, and sometimes I think a word is chosen because it can be taken more than one way.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean, if you look at the way people write nowadays, they do that. So there's
Yeah.
no reason to assume they didn't back then.
Oh, yeah.
You
Okay.
know, and really, that's kind of a literature universal. Wordplay goes back, and wordplay is literally in the Bible. Like we can prove that. So
Right.
yeah.
Right.
So where that ends, that's but that's one of the joy of it, at least for me as a literary type. Now there's mention of names and meanings and stuff like that, but I will say this section actually gives you both perspectives in the Bible, which is that you give somebody a name and it has tremendous significance, but then also people are known by a whole ton of names. So I think sometimes people get really bent out of shape over, this specific syllabic sound is now yours and there's ownership, and it gets a little mystical, which is not really appropriate because people often go by multiple titles and things change and shift because it starts to overly define you if you're just based on one little thing, right? You need multiple definitions in order to really get the full sense of who you are. However, that being said, it is interesting that he has these names with these specific meanings.
The I think there was an Egyptian god Ra,
Mm.
and so I think Potiphar has to do with Ra has given, and I saw Osnat, I think the daughter of a certain goddess.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the kind of names you'd expect in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Even Esther,
Mm-hmm.
she had the name Esther, which is going back to a goddess,
Mm-hmm.
or she had the Hebrew name Hadassah.
Right.
But anyway, uh, I was going to say that nowadays in modern Hebrew, the grammar comes down a little differently. Instead of Asenath, as you see in most Bibles, is in modern Hebrew they pronounce it Osnat. When
Mm.
back in 1969, I was doing archaeological excavations on the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. That's where I got my nickname Indiana Mark. I'm kidding. But anyway, there was a group
You're
of
not
high.
even from Indiana. You're from Connecticut.
Right, I'm from Connecticut, so
Connecticut Mark.
nutmegger Mark. But anyway, on the dig site there were a bunch of teenage girls from a community, a moshav, a
Mm-hmm.
farming community near Haifa, and one of them was named Osnat,
Hmm.
and that was so
Yeah, you
I
don't really hear Osnath much. I mean, it's
no
not one that's caught on in like the evangelical community or
right
anything like
right.
that. She's kind of the forgotten wife. It's kind of sad. I mean, she's not in the text much, but she's just kind of a forgotten.
There you go.
Sean likes her Indiana Mark.
Oh,
Okay.
good.
If you keep laughing at his dad jokes, they're just going to keep coming. So be careful of that. One thing I will point out is that I do think there is a beautiful thing here about also maturity as an adult. And it is a biblical concept, which is a little bit controversial, but that with the coming of the next generation gives you a bit of a restart, a refresh, a moving forward. It can aid a lot in terms of your personal growth. And I do think, unfortunately, society has often, undervalued that and undermined that. And there's a reason for us to be fruitful and multiply. And it's not just so that there's a lot of people on the earth. It's also because it's for our personal benefit. And I can just tell you, as somebody who's had children, the impact it's had on my life. And just I think that's the case for everybody. I think that's a universal. So I think there's something to be said here. I think sometimes people will hold back too on having kids because they're like, well, look at the kind of person I am and the kind of background I have and what's going to happen. And I think there is a certain amount of healing you can have through having children that should not be undervalued. I'm just going to say that. I think that's a biblical example.
Okay.
So, anything else on this section before we move on?
So where have we come to? What
We
verse?
came to Ephraim being born.
Okay, that's a nice
Yep,
conclusion
right
there.
before everything goes bad. So,
Right, double right.
but that famine is coming. We have that ticking clock. It's a great literary device, and it's coming.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that tomorrow. Sound good? All right. Please hit the bell, subscribe, call your friends up, ring up your neighbors, whatever you do. Rent a Skyliner plane to do things in the sky. That'd be awesome. Um. Anyway, it's a great year to read the law with us, and we will see you tomorrow.